Okay, it sounds like we're ready to go, and we probably, my guess is we'll be having a few more people joining us as time goes on. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Most of the time when we do these, I know most of the people on the call. So, and just in case anybody I don't know, my name is John Elsesser. I'm Executive Director of the Indiana Non-Public Education Association. And we're real excited today. One of our business partners, Renaissance Learning, is going to be providing some great professional development for us. In light of COVID, we had to postpone our large conference that we have, our INPEA conference that any of our INPEA members that are on this are well aware of. And in lieu of that, we knew people were still hungry for professional development. So we decided to start this thing we call PD Thursdays. And we reached out to our business partners to help us and provide content specific things and hopefully some things that are relevant to kind of our current situation in education. And as we all know, we're living in the midst of COVID and pandemic and its impact. We just had what we call a third party provider showcase on the utilization of EANS funds earlier this week. And this is professional development through Renaissance is another potential use of your EANS funds. But one of the things we continue to hear about is addressing learning loss that's been the result of multiple different kinds of instructional delivery systems from in-person to hybrid to remote. And we're really excited that Renaissance was willing to step forward and bring expertise to the table to talk about turning COVID learning gaps into growth. And with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to a person who I've known for quite a few years, Dr. Julie Vogel. Used to be the superintendent down in the Diocese of Houston. Is it Houston Galveston? Is that the title, Julie?
Galveston, Houston.
Galveston, Houston. I get them backwards. But she's now the vice president for Catholic and private schools at Renaissance. So, Julie, thank you for being here. I'm going to give a little quick shout out to Carla, who's our local contact person. But I'm going to turn it over to Julie, and she'll introduce our speaker.
Hey, thanks, everyone. And thanks, John. It's really great to see you again. You and I are going to try and connect again soon, I hope. And it's great to see everybody else here today. So yeah, I work at Renaissance Learning, and I am their VP of Government Affairs, and I work with private schools all across the country. So my main job is to make sure I always know what you guys are thinking about, what's important to you, what matters to you, what directions you guys are thinking about moving, how things affect you, and then do everything I can to help Renaissance find great ways to support your efforts out there. And in order to do that today, I have brought along one of my favorite colleagues of all times, the famous Dr. Gene Kearns, and he is going to talk to you a little bit about the results from our How Kids Are Performing study that we did in the fall, and then to tell you a little bit about what's upcoming as well too. But just so you know a little bit about Gene, he is a third generation teacher. Like most of us at Renaissance, we have some sort of teaching background somewhere in our lives. But Gene, I think he tells it like he tells it, it's just in his DNA, and I'll let him tell you the story there. He is our chief academic officer, so he is our thought leader, he is our researcher, he helps make very complicated things easy for the rest of us to understand. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Gene to give you the results and to walk us through our How Kids Are Performing report.
Thank you, Julie. Glad to be here with you. And like Julie, I'm a third generation educator. So our family always says it's in the blood and it's around the dinner table, because the teachers in the family totally outnumber the non-teachers. I'm here today to share with you results of a large study that we did that really attempted to quantify the COVID slide. It's available for free if you go to this URL, and I'm sure someone will paste that into chat for you, but I'd like to make an assertion that I'll try to prove for you, and we'll put this slide back up a little bit later in case you're maybe not ready to download the report right now. I believe that not only should you go to renaissance.com/performing and download this report, I believe that you should bookmark this site, because it's not just about this edition of the report, but there is more research coming that's going to help us understand this grand experiment that we've all been forced into called COVID, because, you know, this is a big experiment, and there is no control group out there. No one got to be, you know, in the control group that didn't get the treatment, if you will. We are all navigating this together, and at Renaissance, we're trying to do a lot of research just to kind of guide the way. And honestly, you know, these are uncharted waters, so everyone's feeling their way along. At Renaissance, we always like to acknowledge the mission statement of our company, which is to accelerate learning. And we are one of the world's largest providers of interim assessment tools. In the average year, students take about 80 million plus assessments from us, which simply means we have a lot of data about how kids perform and how they are growing. And so in a moment when so many people have been asking about what has been the academic impact of COVID, we felt like we had a responsibility to weigh in and provide some answers there, because we had a lot of data that we could mine to produce that answer. So, you know, we really hadn't hardly even begun closing the doors of school before people began to theorize or hypothesize about, you know, what would the impact of, you know, COVID be. I heard pandemic slide. I tend to say COVID-19 slide when I talk about it, but it didn't take, you know, but a day or two for our schools to be closed before suddenly everybody was saying, well, what's going to be the impact? I want to point out that there are some other reports that are out there, particularly one that's some that have been out there for months or longer. And I want you to understand how the report that I'm going to review today is fundamentally different from some others you may have seen. So I've got a couple up on the screen. If you've got really good eyesight or a good pair of glasses like I do, you might be able to make out the date on the one on the left, which was actually the most widely circulated report, or kind of to date. And if you can make it out, it says April of 2020. Well, think about what we thought about all this in April of 2020. We had just barely come to the understanding that we were not likely going to go back into school buildings during the school year. I mean, in March, we thought, we'll be out for a couple of weeks, things will calm down, we'll probably get back by the end of the year. And if not, certainly we know how the start of the year went as well. So the whole point is there have been some reports out there that did not actually look at true, actual back to school performance data. They use some very advanced models to make predictions or projections. And you know, when it comes to making a prediction or making a projection, there is room for things to go wrong. And so quite honestly, if you followed the journal and all the conversations about the COVID slide, there have been some predictions that were made that came true, and there have been some other ones that did not come true. For example, here was an article that came out based on these predictions, and it said, study shows major learning loss. Well, if you haven't even really assessed the kids at back to school, how did you show the learning loss? They didn't show the learning loss. They predicted that this is where the learning loss will be. This one was a large stretch. You know, it said, these are the 5 states where the COVID slide has hit the hardest. They looked at the projections. They looked at the demographics of certain states done in another study. They tried to put the two, and they made this bold claim that they had indeed predicted the states that would be the hardest impact. That is not what was going on. These earliest reports, I use words here from Paul Van Hibbel, a professor at University of Texas, Austin. He said, you need to understand that some of these earliest reports, these early findings, they were statistically informed guesses. And in fact, Megan Kufelt, who wrote the most widely circulated report, that one from back in April, she herself said these early reports took on a life of their own. They went much further than we ever expected. She said they were sometimes spoken about with far more confidence than the actual researchers who wrote them had in the generalizability of their findings. Well, the good news is we don't need to make any more predictions. We are now back into school, and I understand for some that's online or remote or whatever it is. You know, the academic program of the 2021 school year is well underway, so we don't need to make predictions or projections. We can quantify based on actual back to school data. So this report does just that. We looked at actual back to school performance of kids. It involved over 5.3 million kids. That is the largest study that has been done to date by over 1 million students compared to the second largest study. And more importantly, this is both the first and the only to date national study, because the sampling, the students that were involved in this analysis came from all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And they included, oh, sorry, I was in Colorado earlier. I looked up the number for you guys. It was over 35,000 kids from your state. So I apologize, I was looking at Colorado earlier, but let's talk about the source of the data. Where did all this information come from? These are the assessments that we give: reading, math, and early literacy. Basically, in a lot of schools, kids take the test in the fall, in the winter, and in the spring. And this is where it's all coming from. And so we were able to mine this all and find out what's actually going on. Now, before we reveal, pull back the curtains or not, if you will, in chat, make a prediction of your own. Do you think that it's reading or math that is more impacted? Now, those are the only two areas we could report, and we couldn't do anything with science or social studies. We have the reading and math assessment, so that's where we can go. But make a prediction for me. Do you think it's the reading area that is the more impacted, or do you think it's the math area that's more liable to have fallen under current things? Give you a couple seconds there. Hopefully it's coming in chat. Somebody make a prediction. I know you're out there. I can see the participant numbers. Thank you, Heidi, for demonstrating there. We got some votes for math. Another vote there for reading. Oh, we've kind of split the bets there, so all the bets are covered. How about this one? What grade levels do you think have been the most impacted by the recent events? We say it's K-2. Those early grades of school, 3 to 5. Later in elementary school, 6 to 8. The middle grades, or 9 to 12. Which grade levels do you think? All right, I got to vote. Thank you for grades 3 to 5. And specifically reading. Okay, very specific. Thank you. I got to vote for math K-2. Some other folks saying 1 to 3. Oh, you created your own bands there, but that's fine. Early grades. Of course, there was that article I put up there. It said we predict K-2. That was one of the articles that was out there. So definitely people could have made that prediction. Well, let's see what happened. Here's what we found. In terms of reading, what we're finding is things are not all that bad, at least in the way we started the year. What this chart shows you is the predictions we were able to do, which was grades 1 through 8. We could not do high school for 2 reasons. Number one, we have far less users of the assessments in high school, so that sample size is much smaller. And more importantly, where most schools give our assessments to all students, K-8, they only give them to the students that they are targeting for interventions in some high school, which creates a sample that is very much skewed toward the lower ends of performance, so not as representative. So we were able to talk about grades 1 through 8, and what you're seeing here is overall reading performance year over year is about 1 percentile point down. Now, let me point out 2 other very interesting things. What this means is in most grades, what we actually saw was a 2 percentile point drop. And I am sure that some people's eyes are going right towards grade 2, which looks like it's up, and grade 3. Anytime that you see the metrics in here for first grade, second grade, and third grade, there's always going to be an asterisk down at the bottom that says, look at these numbers with caution. We'll talk about the details of this in the limitation, Appendix B. And basically what we believe is going on here is the fact that many students are taking the test remotely, which means their testing is not being fully proctored, and there is a potential that some parents are helping out more than they should. Because, using the words of my colleague Eric Stickney, we have some suspiciously smart students in second grade in particular. So the bad news is we're going to need to do a little bit more work, and I'll show you at the end what we're doing to definitively answer the question about to what extent are these scores potentially inflated. But the good news is, even just using the data that we had from the spring, after about grade 4, there really is no major reason to believe that the scores are being overly inflated when students are testing remotely. And what you see is it's remarkably consistent across these grades. So these numbers are probably higher than they need to be. They probably look something more like those. But overall, a drop of 1 or 2 percentile points in reading is something that we need to watch. But it is something that we can deal with fairly well. Math, however, is a very different story. Unquestionably, math has been the content area that has been far more impacted. What you're seeing is overall a drop of 7 percentile points year over year, with some grades of course, being impacted more. Grades 4 and 5 at -10 year over year, with grades 3 and 6 closely behind them, with a drop of a -8 percentile points year over year. These drops are significant. In just a few slides, I will take those drops and I will turn that into something you can get your hands around. We'll talk about how many weeks of instruction would you need to catch students up, say from a 7 percentile point drop. But this is significant. This is massive impact on math. For most intents and purposes, you can basically assume that when COVID hit us in the middle of last March, it is if someone pressed a giant pause button on mathematics growth. Kids didn't necessarily regress all that much. They did some work and kind of treaded water where they were, but they also really did not move on from there. So the amount of time that we were away from school last spring basically was just treading water. Kids did not move ahead in mathematics. So it has created a very significant impact on the math side of the house. This is another slide that we use because we want to help people understand, well, what does this mean for delivering services to kids? And so what you're looking at is a comparison of year over year screening, understanding that many schools run under an RTI or MTSS multi-tiered system of supports way of looking at their data. In other words, they screen kids 3 times a year. They look to see who's above or below a critical benchmark. In this case, it is the 40th percentile. And basically what it's saying is year over year in reading, there's a little bit of a change, 1% more students falling below this critical benchmark. However, when it comes to math, the change, of course, is more significant. What you're seeing is an increase of about 8% more students potentially in need of intervention services. Now, in a smaller school or smaller district, this is, it turns into something that is manageable. I was, however, on the line the other day with a superintendent who oversees 200,000 kids. And so if that superintendent has 8% more students falling below a critical benchmark and in need of intervention services, that for that individual turns into 16,000 more students requiring intervention services. So the gap or the change year over year in terms of students below a critical benchmark, about 8% more students falling into a category where they may require some intervention or support. The other thing we wanted to look at is the same, metric, some ways of performance, but look at it through the lens of growth. Now, not everybody will be familiar with this score, the SGP, which stands for Student Growth Percentile. It is a growth score that compares students to their academic peers, other students in the same grade and who start at roughly the same level of performance. And it depicts growth for you on a scale that ranges from 1 to 99. So if you get an SGP of 50, your growth is just right on par average. You are growing right on average with your academic peers. Anything above 50 is above normal growth. Anything below 50 is below normal. And generally speaking, for districts and states that use this as an accountability model, they are defining typical growth as anything that's ranging between a 65 and a 35. Can't write that out too easily there. But basically what they're saying is we're going to shoot for 50 and we're going to give ourselves a margin of error of 15 points on either side. What this also means is in any given year, if you were to look at a large sample of students and look at where they fall on this metric, they're going to hover somewhere around 50. Sometimes a little bit higher, sometimes a little bit lower, but generally large populations of kids, when you calculate their SGPs, they will hover somewhere right around 50. And so what this table does is it compares the SGPs of the 2018-19 school year to the 2019-20 school year. And what we see is reading is down a little bit, about 3 SGP points. But remember the story. Reading is impacted a little bit, and mathematics is impacted more. And so on that same metric, you see exactly what I said was a large group of students The SGP will hover somewhere right around 50. In the case of math, it was dead on 50 in 2018, 2019. It dropped all the way down to a 35, down 15 SGP points in the 2019-20 school year. Now, let me point out something about this. The overall year then came in at a 35. That is the absolute lowest number before we be talking about it definitively being low growth. So it was way down. But also think about this. Think about last year's September and October and November and December and January and February. Those months for us were fairly normal. We had not been impacted. We were not closing our buildings. So if we'd looked at SGP scores from the first half, even the first almost 2/3 of last year, they would have been running at somewhere near 50, okay? Because it was a fairly normal year. So we were running at a 50. This chart lets you know that we finished the year at a 35. Think about how low the growth needed to be during the end of March, April and May, and the beginning of June, depending upon where the school year ends for you. Think about how low the growth needed to be during the COVID period to take a year that was running at 50 and pull it all the way down to a 35. As I said, for most intents and purposes, kids stopped growing in math, period. The good news is they didn't really lose any ground from where things started or stopped back in March. But in an overall sense across the country, kids did not move forward the balance of March, all of April, all of May, into whatever it was the end of the year for them. So again, when we look at it through this metric, we lost a lot of ground with mathematics. Now, one of the things that we promised you was that we would let you know how non-public schools did in comparison with public schools. And it is on this next slide. Actually, let me skip this one just in the nature of time. What this also is showing us is, if you see the dark green bars, a lot of low growth in mathematics. This metric was looking at students who fell into the low growth bands, SGPs below 35, typical or average. And what you notice is in normal years like 18, 19, it's roughly a third. But last year, 47% of second graders had a low growth year. 50% of third graders had a low growth year in math. 53%, you see huge areas of dark green, which represent low growth in mathematics across all the grades. Minor variances over here in reading, but you know the story. Reading is impacted somewhat. Mathematics is impacted more. But what about the subgroups, of which public schools versus non-public schools are one? This is what we were able to do. And I want to show you how to read this table, because the format that is used on this table carries through basically all of the remaining tables that I will show you. If you haven't caught on to it already, blue always depicts reading in the report. Green always depicts mathematics. And so what this is saying is, when you see this light blue shaded bar, that is letting you know where reading was overall. Okay. And then you look at a particular demographic. For example, family income is measured through, the presence of Title I in the school. So what this is saying is, okay, when it comes to schools that are Title I schools, in math, they were a little bit below the average, and in reading, they were somewhat below the average. So the dark boxes for each of these groups shows where they are performing in relation to the overall. Now, when we look at this, in some ways, there's not too many surprises. I don't think anybody is overly shocked that high poverty children experience more impact than COVID than their higher income counterparts. Sadly, up here, many of the ethnic groups that often bear the brunt of things did so as well. The one that may be the most interesting to us is this one about school location. And let's use math as an example here. We're comparing rural schools and small town schools with urban center and more suburban schools. And there's an interesting dynamic. in math, and the same sort of makeup in general is there for reading. When it came to math and we looked at overall, students or schools that were more rural or small town in terms of their location, they dropped more than their more suburban or urban counterparts. Same general kind of makeup over here in reading. Now, nothing about the design of the study allows us to prove causality. However, a lot of people predicted that something like this would happen, and the logic of the prediction went like this. So much of what we did last spring was based on remote or distance learning. That if you live in an area where bandwidth is an issue, you will not be able to plug into it just as much. So we know that a lot of small towns often have bandwidth issues. I was listening to NPR just yesterday, and they were talking about some areas where, it wasn't just that the kids couldn't plug in, the teachers themselves couldn't really well get online to even put up the lessons or do the videos. And so while clearly there were some subgroups that were impacted, I think a lot of these things were things we understood what would sadly have happened in terms of poverty in certain ethnic groups. But this one's really an interesting one as well. It's not something we've necessarily explored before. And it talks about just access. The superintendent of the Dallas Independent School District in Dallas, Texas, said we may need to begin to view internet access as almost a civil rights issue. He said, we shudder to think of a child going home to a house where there's not running water or heat or, electricity. And it's certainly not quite the same. But we should also shudder to think about all the kids that go home to where there is no connectivity, because in our world today, much of what we're able to do is based upon our ability to get online and access things. So let me pause for just a minute and see whether there were any items that came up in chat or on questions and answers that we might want to address before we press on. So Julie, others, anything that we want to talk about or address before we move on just a bit?
Mute myself. I don't see any questions in chat, but one question keeps running through my mind, and maybe you're going to address this, or maybe we can't address it. But
yes.
Why is there such a drop? Are there any in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade? Like, does anyone ever talk about what the possibilities could be around the why?
Yes, that's actually part of some future research that we're working on right now. What we found, if you map the relative difficulty of skills in math, 4th and 5th grade are some grade levels where there is some math content that just is really very difficult. So for example, the multiplication and division of fractions, it's very hard for kids. They don't pick it up easily. It requires a lot of support. We also found that, for example, around 6th grade level, you're bumping into things like not just area, but area of, parallelograms and more irregular shapes. These are very hard things for kids to get their heads around. And so these were topics that were difficult in any year, but became that much more difficult to impart in a year when things were disrupted. So, the short answer, Julie, is it appears that there are just some pieces of particularly math content that are disproportionately difficult for kids. And the grades that were the most impacted actually are some of the grades that have a disproportionate share of these disproportionately difficult things. We're working on an additional study, and that's another reason I wanted folks to bookmark renaissance.com/performing, because that continuing dialogue and the insights we can offer, they will be posted there.
I'm looking forward to that.
All right. Other questions?
I don't see any others in the chat.
All right, we will press on. So there's actually two tables in the report that break it down by these groups. And in really, in most purposes, they are the same, because the first table uses percentile rank changes. So you see that up at the top. The second table, its companion table, uses the student growth percentiles that we spoke about before. These two scores would rise and fall together. So if your growth rate was lower as measured by your student growth percentile, you would have dropped or slid more in your percentile ranks. So what you will see is, even though the metrics a little bit different and kind of spread things out just a little bit, the overall picture that is painted is basically the same. Now, some may say, why include both tables if they really speak to the same thing? Because in some schools, a lot of the conversation is driven by percentile ranks. So if those were not there, they wouldn't really connect with the information. In some states, where particularly the ones where student growth percentiles are baked into their state test and many of their accountability formulas, they would be looking for this metric to be there. So those two tables really kind of tell the same story, but they use the different metric, which creates just a little bit of a wider spread there, but they are basically telling us the same thing. But this brings us to the next poll question. You've gotten this idea. Math is more impacted than reading. We've proven that several times. And in terms of the hardest impacts, we know that it's on grades 4 and 5, closely followed by 3 and 8 in math, where kids are anywhere between 7 to 10 percentile rank behind. My question to you is, how many weeks of instruction do you think it would be necessary to catch them up with that kind of drop? Just make a guess there. If you're 7 to 10 percentile points behind, how many weeks of instruction would you need? How many weeks would we have had to bring you into school before the year even started, before we could catch you up just to be back where you are? I see some guesses, 8 to 11. I also saw a question in there about multiplication. And Nua, I hope I pronounced your name right. What we found is the hardest thing for third graders to do in math: area of a rectangle. And if you think about it, there's two reasons that's hard. Number one, multiplication in and of itself is hard. It's new to them. They've just gotten their hands around it. The other reason is, up until about third grade, most of geometry is just measurement. So we're measuring the length of things. Suddenly in grade 3, we begin to put those things together and it becomes area. So in finding the area of a rectangle, you are both bringing a new operation, mathematics, and pairing it with a new way of thinking about geometry, area, and you're putting both of those two new things together, which makes it about the hardest. You all did really well with your predictions, because here are our estimates for how many weeks of instruction it would take to catch kids up. Again, this is just like the other chart before: blue overall, reading overall, green is math overall. And what this is saying is, math overall is going to take about 8 to 11 weeks of instruction, or would have needed that to catch kids up, with some of the most impacted grades needing 12 or more weeks. Overall, reading is pretty close to expectations, 3 or less weeks behind, but there are some grade levels that might be 4 to 7 weeks behind. Now, let me point out two things. First of all, this does not mean, let's just use math overall as our example, where we're saying 8 to 11 weeks. This does not mean that after 8 to 11 weeks of school, students would have been caught up. No. This means that you would have needed to bring kids in for a math class every day for 8 to 11 weeks before school started, not to catch them up to maybe the benchmarks that were set for them, just to catch them up to where they typically began the year. Okay, so that's substantial. We're talking about 2 to nearly 3 months of a daily math course to catch kids up. The other thing is, when we talk about weeks of instruction, this is based on our historical data. We at Renaissance, like I said, we give a lot of assessments. We can calculate weekly growth rates. However, the only data that we have to calculate weekly growth rates comes from a pre-COVID era, excuse me. So when we say, for example, that math overall is going to take 8 to 11 weeks of instruction to catch up, we're talking about the rate at which we could typically move kids 8 to 11 weeks prior to COVID. The question we have to answer right now is, and how are kids growing this year? Are we covering as much content? Are we moving as quickly? Are kids growing as much? And I'm sure that many of you can imagine answers that say, maybe not. Things are disrupted. We are flexing in and out, some cases, of different modes of service. You know, there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot going on. There's all the socio-emotional pressure on top of all of this. So when we say it could take 8 to 11 weeks, we were talking about pre-COVID undisrupted weeks. If we are not, under current conditions, able to cover as much content and move across ground as quickly as we could before, then that turns into even more weeks needed to catch kids up. If you also think about it, these estimates, which range somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2.5, 3 months, that's basically how much time students were away from school. And again, as I said, the giant pause button was hit and things really stopped. So the other thing that we wanted to do that honestly has not been in all the other reports is we did not want to just frame and admire the problem. The world doesn't need another report that says, you know, what do we think the problem is? We need to frame the problem so we understand how urgent we need to be in addressing it, but we also need answers. How are we going to deal with this? Where are we going to go? What are we going to do? How do we get as much growth as we can? How do we catch kids up? How do we address their lost learning? How do we close the gaps that have possibly been created by COVID? So I'm sure I already saw a little bit of chatter there. I didn't catch the whole context. I think someone already said that they were using this. If you go to this URL, renaissance.com/focus skills, you will be able to access what we call our Focus Skills Resource Center. And on that webpage, what you're able to do is you're able to find out the most essential skills for reading and math for each grade. So let me just take you over there for just half a second. This is available to everybody. It is free. You don't have to be a Renaissance customer. So again, renaissance.com/focus skills. Our time today does not allow me to go into all the details of it, but you'll notice this blue bar that says, watch our webinar about how to use these. If you click that orange button and watch the webinar, it will explain how these were developed, how you navigate these tools, how you would use them. But let me show you what's waiting right there. For any state, you can click on the state in question, and you can see across all the grades the most important skills. So what it's saying here is, in terms of absolutely essential skills, first grade, it's got a lot, 49. In terms of literacy in math, there's different distributions. They could show up in different places here. In this case, it's 7th grade. That's got 26 absolutely non-negotiable skills. So when we say focus skills, what we're saying is, these are skills that you absolutely must get because they are the foundations. They are the prerequisites for future learning. So these are 26 skills, for example, that if you don't get them in the 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, and future learning is going to be impeded because these are the foundations upon which the future learning is based. The reason that they are so important for us right now is if we want to build a plan for kids to catch up, to skip ahead quickly as they can, we don't have time to cover topics with kids that aren't absolutely essential. Now, I don't know if you've realized this, but if you take any standard set, if you look at any state standards, there are topics contained in there that are absolutely essential. We know those have to be there. For example, the early grades phonics and reading instruction lessons, you have to get those skills because you use them for the rest of your life. But sometimes there are topics that are of value, nice to have, but they are extras. Let me give you an example, and I'll use an example from England so I don't offend any state. I was working with some teachers in the UK, and they were looking at their grade level and looking at their focus skills, and there was a lot of stuff there around place value. And that makes sense, because if you don't get place value, there's a lot of future topics in math that are really, really held back. At that same year level, there were a couple of standards on Roman numerals. Now, let's be clear. If I put up a big number in Roman numerals, I really doubt that most of you could interpret it and translate it into our standard number system. In fact, I believe that there are folks who hold PhDs in mathematics that couldn't interpret often Roman numerals, okay? So if the grade teachers or the teachers at that grade level, if they don't cover place value, the forward progress for their kids is really, really, really impeded. But if they don't have time to make it to the Roman numeral standards, there's just nothing as bad that's going to happen. I should also go back there for just a second. It makes it easy to see when you go to that website. If you scroll down, or let me get in there, you can scroll down to the map and click on a state, or if you hover over any grade and drill into it, when you get into the interface, you begin to see the skills, and maybe one of the easiest things to do. You can expand these and look at the skills and move back and forth, but notice right up here where it says Indiana Math PDF. If I was in literacy, of course, it would say Indiana Literacy PDF. If you click on that, it'll open up a PDF that lists all of these absolutely essential skills for you. So you can see them grade by grade and domain by domain. You can see exactly what the most essential skills are for kindergarten into first grade, all the way up. So that's a really easy way to access them and use them. We also said that we talk about how to plan the type of instruction that's necessary to catch kids up. And again, watch that webinar. It'll give you all of the details on the focus skills. It'll tell you how to navigate that tool if you need a little bit of help, give you their history, their development, their research base. But ultimately, it comes down to how are you going to plan instruction? This graphic I'm going to show you, maybe Julie or someone else can find it. If you search deciding what to teach, here's how in EdWeek, it's the #1 search that'll come right back. And the editors at EdWeek developed this infographic. Now, they were quick to say, this is not solely our thinking. It is based on multiple recommendations coming out from multiple state agencies and think tanks. But this graphic basically says, how should we be thinking about the instruction that we are planning right now? How should we be deciding what to teach? Here's their recommendation. Step #1. Look at the standards for the subject and the grade level that you are teaching and figure out the absolute priority content. Now, again, the Focus Skills Resource Center will tell you that. You could look up, if you're teaching 6th grade math, it's going to list that most essential stuff. I think this is step 1, because what it's saying is if you're teaching 6th grade math, you've got to know what you must cover this year, which means in figuring out what you must cover, you will also figure out the things that you can be a little bit less urgent about, because you know what? You're going to have to do some backfill because there's been some lost learning. So once you figure out what matters the most, start doing your grade level instruction. If your pacing guide says you start with a unit on geometry, then start with that very same grade level unit on geometry. But as you start planning that unit, ask yourself, what are the prerequisites that students must have in place to be successful with this grade level unit? And if you look at the resource that I showed you for the Focus Skills Resource Center, you will see that the domains are color coded. So if you are teaching 2nd grade and you're working on the geometry unit and you want to know, well, what were the prerequisites from 1st grade on geometry? All you need to do is scroll back and look for that same color. So again, the Focus Skills Resource Center can really help there as you are planning your grade level instruction, but thinking deeply about the prerequisites that should be there. Finally, what they say is, as you think about these prerequisites, don't assume anything. You likely want to create a little quiz or a quick activity that will check to make sure that your students have mastered those essential ideas. So if there are prerequisites in place, don't assume they're there, check on them. Step number 3. If you find that they're there, move on. But if you find that they are struggling with those prerequisites, then you have to go to step number 4, which is review them with the kids. Do some additional instruction, do an addressing of that unfinished learning. And if you had to go to step 4, you also have to go to step 5, which is after you reviewed them, then you're going to need another quiz or another activity to make sure whether your review was successful or not. The reason that we believe that the Focus Skills Resource Center, again, which is free to all schools, can be so helpful is, first of all, it answers question number 1 is about what is the most important work at the grade level where I am teaching. And then it guides you to find these essential prerequisites so that you can check on them and make sure that they are in place and decide whether you need to give that additional instruction and then the subsequent additional assessment after that. I want to end with 2 last things here, but let me pause for just a minute and see if anything came in the chat that we would like to address. Julie?
Don't see any questions in the chat. This is probably one of the quietest groups today.
All right. Well, my morning group was like awake and probably had like 3 cups of coffee or something because they had a bajillion questions. So I can go for a peaceful afternoon, but I'd love questions too. We'll have one more chance at the end, so you can save them to there. What about your state? Again, if you go to renaissance.com/performing, where the report is, if you scroll down, you can see how things are playing out in Indiana. And the news for literacy is a little bit concerning. Overall, Indiana has about 2% more kids below the benchmark. So where the nation as a whole has about 1% more kids below the benchmark in literacy, Indiana has about 3% more below the benchmark in literacy. And with math, fortunately, there's a nice story. The nation as a whole has about 7%, or excuse me, 8% kids more below the benchmark, while in Indiana, things did not slide quite as much, 7% more there. As any other study does, we ended with what could we not answer in this report, and what do the findings of this report suggest as the next questions? And so here are some of the things. The most important thing we should all be asking ourselves now is, how are kids growing this year? Because how kids are performing, the first edition of the report, what it said is, how did kids start the school year? How far behind are they? The next question is, what is happening this year? So, for example, the report made us, we were able to document what happened during the COVID year from 19 into 20. We know how kids are starting the year. We know that they are behind. All of this we know. What we don't know is what comes after this, okay? So there's 3 possibilities. It could be that we're making our way through this year and things are just kind of moving along at a normal rate, which means the gaps are there. We're not closing them. So we're moving ahead, we're growing kids, but we're unable to move fast enough to close the gap. That would be maybe my second best choice. Maybe that's it. Or maybe we're addressing these gaps. Maybe we're moving ahead quickly enough that we are indeed closing these gaps that COVID created, but we just don't know yet. And sadly, I am sure that in some areas, in some places, things are still so disrupted that these gaps began the year of one size and they may have grown. Again, we just don't know, but we are answering that question right now. So as I said, most kids take the test in the fall, in the winter, and again in the spring. So roughly between the 15th of January and the 15th of February, millions of test records come into us. So our research team is standing by, which over the next couple of days, when that testing activity begins to drop off, they're going to take that data and they're going to start mining that data. And we are going to produce a supplement to the report that will come out sometime in early spring. And again, it's going to be posted at renaissance.com/performing. We will let you know what we've learned about growth rates and what that means. Are these gaps widening? Are they being maintained, or are they shrinking? So the number one question is how kids are growing. We will address that. We will also address this remote versus in-person testing thing. We will be able to answer the idea of how much variance are you seeing because kids are testing remotely. We now have in place controls where we can know whether a test is being taken in a school building or away from a school building. We will also talk about the missing students. For example, one report said about 25% of all homeless children have not shown back up in school. We also see in some states, early grades kids have not come back. Kids that were in school for kindergarten didn't come back for first grade, and some of the kids that were expected for kindergarten didn't show up because in some areas, parents are afraid to send their little ones into the building. Sometimes they're keeping them at home. Sometimes they're doing learning pods. Sometimes they're sending them to private and parochial options. There's been some areas where that's been a boon for private and parochial schools. All of this means there's been a tremendous amount of movement in student populations. In some cases, they've gone to other schools. In some cases, they've just not been in our systems. We will explore who is not here, who was with us the year before and who is not with us this year, and what patterns do we see. We also hope, and I use the word hope, and I put an asterisk there where it says instructional models. We also hope to be able to say something about the difference in growth rates depending upon whether kids are doing completely face-to-face instruction or completely hybrid instruction or totally remote instruction. I put an asterisk there because that is a hard thing, because some schools started remote and then they went in, and some schools started hybrid and then they went back to totally, it's been the flux, it's been the change. Actually, we were working with one state this morning. They did their own analysis of this and they found out something shocking. They found out that it was their face-to-face kids that weren't growing the most. And at first there was this look of sheer panic. And then someone said, but remember, it was our special education kids and children with special needs that we prioritized to get back in the building. So we don't have all the kids back in the building. We have our special needs kids back in the building. So we shouldn't be quite as shocked that they aren't growing quite as much because of the challenge. You get the point. It is just hard because it's a moving target. We're going to try. We will be able to talk about growth. We will be able to talk about remote versus in-person testing. We will be able to talk about in-person or missing students. We hope to be able to say something about those instructional models. We're going to give it a try, but we'll see. Again, that's why I want you to not just go here and get this report. I want you to bookmark the site. I want you to come back, watch for that supplement in the spring. We're glad to come back and do an update for you when the data comes out, because that's the next question. What is happening to growth this year? And what does that mean for these gaps that have been created? They are either shrinking, growing, or being maintained, and we need that answer next, and we will have that soon. So we have a couple of minutes here for questions if there are any. I haven't seen a whole lot in chat, so maybe there are, maybe there are not. Julie, John, Heidi, others.
Gene, lots of good information, and you opened this up with, and I've been hearing a lot about the learning loss, but it's all generic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You all are dealing with actual data, which, especially as we're looking at the spending of the EAMS funds, which has a allowable use in that whole learning loss area. This kind of information
language
is
in there
invaluable.
addressing learning loss. Yeah, so you can tap into that money, and things that you do to address learning loss are, pairing up with that money.
Yeah, so I'll be curious to hear the update as well.
Yeah, it's the next most important question. What is happening? Because I hope we're closing the gaps. If I can't get that, I hope then we're just not letting them grow. But depending upon disruptions, they could be getting worse. And in all three of those outcomes, mean something different for us.
Yeah, you may or may not be aware, in Indiana, we take the state test, at least any of our state accredited non-public schools and any of our voucher schools all take the state test.
Yes.
There's been great debate this year about whether they were going to do the assessment. And our Department of Education has come out and said they will. Mm-hmm. They're getting a lot of pushback from some of the public school superintendents, but others are saying we need the data to determine, really where the gaps are, but we also get graded. There's a school accountability process in Indiana where schools are graded A to F. And they are coming back and saying schools, there will be consequences. They're not going to be held accountable, but they feel like they need the data to really determine, how much loss there has been.
That's been a very common approach, John. So I've seen more than one state that has removed those kind of ratings. They're saying we're going to do it, and it's just going to be for information purposes. We're not going to do the A to Fs. We're not going to do the ranking. I think part of it is the states have also been waiting to see a new administration come in and what stance do they take. It's a difficult situation because there are advocates for some disadvantaged kids that say we need that data that shows that they're behind. We might need the accountability piece. So it's an interesting dynamic there. But here is, and actually this morning I was on the line with the legislators in Colorado. Here's the thing legislators are beginning to think about. Those gaps that I showed you in math, those are so large. It is not realistic to think that schools will close those in a year. So we may need a multi-year additional installments in growth kind of thing. It also gives us that new benchmark to say, okay, what did COVID really do? So when we do start bringing the accountability back online, what kind of flexibility should there be? So that's kind of where the policy conversation is going right now. And clearly with math, it is unrealistic. There has never been a year, even in the most successful schools that you would see in the data set, there's never been a year where enough growth would have been achieved to erase those gaps that the COVID disruptions created in math.
Well, in Indiana, we've been seeing the math concerns for even prior to COVID. And in other states, I'm hearing some of the same things. And it's above my pay grade in my mental capacity.
Yeah, but, I don't do policy in that mess.
One of the things that is being addressed in legislation here in Indiana is the possibility of moving away from consequence kind of based assessment with the trade-off of being increased transparency, where they would move to dashboards. Yeah. And as I look at the data that you all are providing, I'm wondering if there's any opportunities for you all to be dialoguing with the state about, how to make those dashboards, truly talk about student performance and student growth. But, and again, like I said, that's above my mental capacity. But when I look at the data you're providing, I can see that's something that could translate into providing valuable information to a dashboard system if that's the direction the state of Indiana goes.
We do interface with the states, and there were those assessment innovation grants that were part of Race to the Top. So there's been some interesting work. Part of it's been very pioneering. Part of it's also been very difficult because in some states they said, we won't do that big summative test. We'll just do interims, like our STAR test. Here's the problem with that. The minute that the interim test gets those accountability pieces, everything motivationally around it changes. The pressure, so it's really a hard kind of thing. Personally, across the board, I think across the country, what we're going to see is we may or may not give the tests. That's going to vary, but I don't think we're going to have any accountability pieces. We're not going to have those ratings or the rankings for a while. Texas is crazy. They're saying you're going to take the test and you must come in the building. And I'm sure some parents are going to say, yeah, that's not happening. I am more of I am more in favor of the growth perspective and the measures. And I think that's been the best thing that happened under ESSA. It wasn't just about performance, but it had to be about growth too. And it was an equal weighting kind of thing. So a year's growth for every year of time. I just put this up so everybody could see the information in case anybody had to log off. We'll stay for as long as you want for questions. And again, policy terrifies me. I'm the educational researcher. I know pedagogy, but turning it into policy just, scares the bejesus out of me. But it is a very interesting conversation that is moving at a lightning speed around the country. And yay for that second round of stimulus money. So there's more money coming. So fortunately, it's not like we have a problem with no funding. We've got a problem and we got some funding to address it with. So that's a better.
And in the non-pub sector, we're not used to having funding. So when we found out we're going to have $81.2 million just
Yeah.
for non-pubs in Indiana.
And the language is you can use high quality assessments, addressing learning loss, summer learning, extended time. Those are all things that are within the wheelhouse of all of that. So basically everything we talked about here, you can connect it right to that. And there's a lot of things that you can do with that funding. So I said, at least that's one of those situations where it's not just a problem. We have a problem and some funding. I'd rather have that than a problem and no funding.
Agreed.
So,
Well, we appreciate you all being here. Like I said, and we didn't have huge numbers today, but as I scanned the list, we had some really cool top school leaders on this call, some superintendents and assistant superintendents. And so, I think we've got the right group to hear the message. And I'm guessing this won't be the only opportunity that we'll have for, to be able to share this information and to continue sharing updated information. So we'll be keeping in touch with Carla and Julie as well. So appreciate Renaissance's partnership with us and appreciate you all sharing this information and really opening our eyes to really some of the specific impacts that we're seeing around the pandemic and its impact on education around the country.
Thank you, John. We appreciate the opportunity, and we'd love to come do an update when that's ready, because again, that's the next question for us.